Today on Mysterion, Happy New Year, and we're wrapping up Season 3. Two friends,
two pastors,
two theologians,
pursuing spiritual life
by exploring the Scriptures
in conversation with the fathers. I'm Dr. Wes Arblaster.
And I'm Dr. Ethan Smith.
And we are
Mysterion. All right, Wes, we're in our final week looking at Mary, who shows us what it is to be a human being as a God-bearer.
That's right.
But before we get there, we're just coming out of the holiday season. How do you feel?
I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah?
I got sick for a few days during Christmas, but I'm ready, and I'm starting off the new year and with a full tank of gas, so I'm ready to go.
With a full tank of gas?
Yeah, man. Yep.
I have a full tank of gas. I just mean I'm fat because of how I've been eating over the holidays. The tank's a little fuller than it normally is.
Which is a great little segue, because next season that we're getting into, we're going to be getting into some of the spiritual disciplines revolving around fasting and the spirituality of fasting. I'm kind of exciting, right? So,
is that your nice way of saying I need to cut the fat out of the show and lose some weight?
Yeah, pretty much.
You won't let me sit beside you here anymore?
The guy that's probably like 25 pounds less than me. Yeah, I'll get you on.
I weigh more than you.
You do?
Yeah.
We'll have to talk about this later.
I'm sure of it.
Muscle weighs more than fat. Thank you, John. More than fat. There you go. Why you take his side, John? What's the deal, man? Come on.
He knows. He knows.
Anyway, we're going to be jumping into the next season, which is actually going to prepare us for Lent. I'm actually really excited about this. Talked to a couple people on the discussion page, the Mysterion Facebook discussion page, and we want to explore together not only talking a little bit about fasting, some spiritual practices, but actually take that journey together. And in preparation for that, we're going to be talking a little bit about the spirituality of prayer, fasting, and ascetic life as it relates to our transformation into Christ, and that in preparation for Lent. So actually we can walk through Lent with our Mysterion friends.
We're going to talk about it before Lent, give people the theology and the practice of it, prepare us, and then maybe invite people to come along on a certain kind of ascetic journey with us through Lent that we can do together.
We'll be talking about the ups and downs together, and we're hoping that we can have enough community engagement through the discussion page on Facebook that we can kind of help each other out and kind of walk through this stuff together, because Lent has been something traditionally that is practiced in community, and so we're hoping to be able to do some of that for those folks who don't necessarily come from liturgical traditions or traditions that observe the calendar. We thought that we could do that with you, so we want to invite you on that. But before we dive into that stuff, we're going to be wrapping up our Only Human series about Mary, right?
That's what we're doing today. Yes, sir.
All right. Well, I guess I'll go then.
Well,
I want to say we're being a little bit more casual today.
We've
really dug into a lot of scriptures. We've done a lot of deep content. And we thought it would probably be most helpful to wrap up this series, not by diving into a whole bunch of more substance. We are going to be going through some scriptures in the Gospel of John, but really to have more of an open, casual conversation about the spiritual significance of Mary, not just Mary as the God-bearer, as the one who bore Christ within her womb, but actually the personality of Mary as it's expressed in a relationship to Jesus. So we thought having a conversation about that following some of these episodes in the Gospel of John would really kind of open some doors for us to have a conversation.
I think it makes room for us to bring our own lives into what we're talking about this season, right? So instead of just this figure Mary and the theological interest in an abstract sense, her relevance to spiritual life, we can actually talk about what it's like living in our world, even kind of contrast the ideal of Mary to some of the ideals we have maybe in the church today and the way we practice. That I think would give us, actually merge well with season 2 that we did quite a bit with Evagrius on seeking holiness by rooting out the passions. So let's talk about Mary. I think one of the things that when Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox talk about Mary is that Protestants seem to say, well, look, what's the big deal? She's hardly mentioned in the Gospels, right? Not much at all, and even less so in the epistles of the New Testament. Whereas Catholics and Orthodox, they say, boy, she's a big, big deal. And they don't seem fazed by the fact that we have relatively few stories about her in the Gospels. And as we were talking, it seems like that whole debate is premised on not the whole debate, but this idea that she barely shows up, therefore she's unimportant, seems to have a problematic assumption laying behind it, right? Which is that, well, I don't know how to say this. In order to be a model, to be a big deal, you need to be a big personality, right? A loud person, someone making waves, having impact, and so on and so forth. And Mary's just not really doing that in the story. But that doesn't mean she's not a big deal.
Yeah, I think there's two things to say about that. One is we need to remember that just because there's not necessarily a lot of, let's say, textual real estate is given over to a character or a figure within the scriptures doesn't mean that they're not important. One example, of course, would be the story of Adam and Eve themselves. I mean, it's a very tiny story in relationship to the scriptures as a whole. There's so much more said about, for example, Samuel or David or any of these other characters, and yet, of course, Adam and Eve, as they figure theologically and their relevance to the whole story of the gospel, the whole story of God coming as our Savior, they are really, really important. So we can't correlate just a lot of scriptural real estate with someone's importance.
Right.
So we have to put that aside. And then on top of that, I think what you're trying to highlight here is the actual character of Mary, the fact that we're going to find that the very way that Mary engages in her relationship with Jesus both shows her prominence, but in a kind of paradoxical way. It shows her prominence precisely because she doesn't predominate.
Right.
And I think that we're going to look at that, and I think it's going to actually teach us a lot about spiritual life as it's lived by someone who is seeking union with Christ that way. So I think one of the things we are going to explore the Gospel of John specifically in some of these passages in the Gospel of John. But I think it would be important to start off by saying that even though Mary isn't given a huge amount of, like I said, scriptural real estate in the Gospel of John, she's at the most pivotal and fundamental moments, we would say, in the Gospel of John. We find most of you know, the Gospel of John starts off with the prologue talking about the Word becoming flesh, right? And then we have this little quick description about John the Baptist proclaiming that Jesus is going to come. And then we have the disciples saying, hey, let's go see what's going to happen. Let's go, let's follow this Jesus guy. And then the first thing that they see, the very first story where we witness the glory of Christ manifest, it's all surrounding Mary and Jesus. And so the encounter that we find in the beginning of chapter 2 with the wedding of Cana opens up the whole story. It is the first great act, the first great sign of who Jesus is, and it also is going to point to the very end. And so my point is she plays a very pivotal role in these pivotal moments as John builds the book, as John writes the book of the Gospel of John that way. Yeah.
So it's good to remember that the Gospel of John, it's very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you're familiar with the four Gospels, you know it's very different. And the miracles in the Gospel of John play a slightly different role. They're called signs by John. They're not just proof of Christ's divinity or the fact that he's the Messiah. They are indications of who and what he is, right? His mission, his very personality, and the signs are bound together in these really important ways. And so there are seven big signs in the Gospel of John. And the first one we're going to look at involves Mary. It's actually the first place she shows up in the Gospel. And then we'll look at two other places where she shows up. One place people don't even realize it is about Mary, but it is, and it shows up. The other thing to say is, as we go through these passages, remember what we've been talking about here for some time, especially this season. When you read the scriptures, you're looking for patterns, repeated words that tie and bind things together. And as we're going to read about Mary in the Gospel of John, we're going to see a set of words appearing again and again and again. I want to throw those out there right now. We're not going to dive into them, but just as we read these, have your ears listening for them. There is the phrase, the mother, there is woman, and there is our, right? So there is the woman, the mother, not just mother, but the mother, woman, and our. And we're going to see this appear again and again and again. And it's going to tie Mary and Jesus' story together in a really interesting way that tell us a lot about her, but also tell us a lot about what our calling is as well. Do you want me to go ahead and read this first story, and then we can talk about it?
Yeah, let's do it.
So it starts in chapter 2 of the Gospel of John. As I said, it's the first of these 7 great signs. And in this story, we'll see it's got maybe the whole gospel already sort of pre-contained in it. I'll go ahead and read starting in John 2, verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to her, Woman, what has that to do with you and me? My hour has not yet come. And then we know the rest of the story. I'm just going to stop there. Mary says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you," and then he turns the water into wine, and there's a big party, and there's a lot of wine, and it's a big party. So that's the story.
You want me to say something about that?
Say something about that.
Well, one thing we got to remember, folks, that when we go to the scriptures, there's no word in scripture that is just superfluous. The writers themselves, if we want to understand the biblical writers themselves, they choose their words very carefully because they sculpt those stories to communicate spiritual truths. So the writers intend each word to be taken seriously and to be saturated with meaning. And then on top of that, remember, when we read the scriptures, we're looking for Jesus Christ on every page and us with Jesus Christ on every page. And so those words also have that kind of relevance or significance as well. So it's good when we read to read slowly and then say, why is that passage in there? Or why is that passage in there? Because usually it's in there for a reason to bring insight into our relationship with Christ.
Just real quick, to your point about every word is chosen very carefully, I think it's hard for us to understand this in our world where there's writing and reading everywhere in our world. In the ancient world, very few people could read. Fewer yet had the kind of wealth and access to writing utensils, things to write on, and things to read. Our world is saturated with written stuff. It's up here, it's on our sign, it's everywhere. But in that world, there's very little writing. And when you have the ability to write, you don't have a lot. Usually you don't have a lot of paper or whatever you're writing on. So it's chosen super carefully. Right. And each word carries this abundance of meaning. It's like in a movie where you're watching a movie, there's no detail that's accidental.
Yeah, this is a point. This is a point that actually C.S. Lewis makes, and the reason why I bring up C.S. Lewis is because C.S. Lewis was a expert trained in classical literature and medieval literature, and he points out that it is not until much, much, much later in the modern age that people start putting in what looks like insignificant information in order to make the scene feel more realistic. That was never an attribute in ancient literature and medieval literature. If something was put into a story, it was put into the story for some reason. Now, I bring that up, this is why. Because when we go to the Gospel of John and we start off and it says, on the third day, now, if we're reading a novel today, a present-day novel, that somebody might put in something like that just to kind of give you the context, just to kind of say, oh, I'm part of the scene. It's on the third, but it has no relevance on the third day. But if John's doing it's because there's a reason. He's putting on the third day, not to get you in the mood to kind of experience the scene, but to communicate something. And it's obvious when we talk about on the third day, as soon as we hear third day, 3 days, we're thinking Paschal mystery. We are thinking the 3-day passage. The people that are going to be reading this story are going to be, that immediately is going to invoke that kind of imagery. And he's deliberately doing that to kind of signal, which is something that John does throughout the entire gospel. Everything is pointing to the cross in the Gospel of John. So it's all pointing to the cross.
So it's noteworthy, right? On the third day, you think, you run right to resurrection. As you say, the passage through death, the 3 days. And then the next words are, there was a wedding, right? So often the coming of the kingdom of God is talked about as terms of a wedding feast. Next words, the mother of Jesus was there. And then that already reminds us, this is the Gospel of John, where we learn that when Christ dies, his mother was with him.
Right.
So in this first sign in the Gospel of John, this first miracle, the whole gospel is here. The resurrection is evoked. The fullness of the kingdom of God is evoked. The crucifixion, where Mary is there with them, is invoked. It's all right there in that first sentence.
So, yes, and that's important. So I want you to, this is the kind of way we're trying to help everyone here try to learn to read in this fashion so we don't miss this stuff. Just prior, the very few verses prior to John chapter 2, we have one of the disciples say, let's go, Rabbi, are you the Son of God? You are the King of Israel. And Jesus responds and he says to them, this is the direct verse preceding. Very truly, I tell you, you will see the heavens open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Mm-hmm. You're going to see this, guys. You're going to see the fact that heaven and earth are going to be united through me. And then on the third day,
there was a wedding.
Right? So you can see what the author is doing here and trying to set the stage for that and placing Mary right at the center of that scene. Right at the center of that scene, right with Jesus, her relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, like you said, that passage before hints at the marriage of heaven and earth. On the third day, there was a wedding.
Yes.
So notice that. And then, of course, we also have the issue of wine, which makes us think of communion or the Eucharist, right? Which is how we celebrate
feast.
the feast, right? And what's interesting is Mary, who in a lot of ways symbolizes the church, is asking for the wine, right? And Jesus, of course, responds, my hour has not yet come, but of course, then he does produce the wine. All this, again, also reminds us of the crucifixion scene in the Gospel of John, because after Christ has died, the spear goes into his side, and blood and water flow out of his side, which is a symbol of the wine or in communion. Right. So it's all contained in here very carefully. And then let's note the character of Mary in the story, right? What do we see her do? She asked for the wine, which we know, hint, hint, she's asking for, the communion wine. She wants, it's wedding wine, but really it's the wedding of the kingdom of God. Wine she's asking
and
for.
This is interesting. Why is she asking? She's not asking for herself. She's asking for the needs of the crowd, the needs of the people that are there. And what do we have? What do we have at the crucifixion? We have Christ surrounded by a crowd. And who is that crowd, as we've learned throughout the Gospel of John? They are in need of, John highlights this, life, eternal life, right? And what we find is Mary, right, and Christ at the center, and all of a crowd of people surrounding them, empty, in need, right? Exactly. And Mary requests from Christ, right? They have no wine, right? And we'd be thinking about the Eucharistic chalice or the cup that's going to carry Christ's blood, right? They have no wine. And then we have Jesus' response, right? Which I think you want to talk about.
So let's talk
really
about that for a second. People argue about his response, and usually I think both sides actually miss the point. His response to her after she says they have no wine, he says, "Woman, what has that to do with you and me?" which seems kind of rude. And in fact, debates about this passage usually revolve around whether or not Jesus is being rude. And one side, typically Protestant, says, look at how he's kind of like putting her down. She's not important. He's just calling her woman. And then others will respond, no. In the ancient world, that was a perfectly nice way. Like I've seen translations that say, madam. Both of which actually miss the point of Christ calling her woman. These three stories we're going to look at here today, they're playing off of the way Eve is presented in Genesis 2, 3, and 4, which we don't have to get into much. But in the Greek version of Genesis 2, 3, and 4, which everybody read, the Septuagint, we've talked about that on some episodes. Eve, before she's named Eve, is called the woman again and again and again. And then when she becomes, is referred to as the mother of the living when she is named Eve. And then there's this whole thing about when she has her first child, she says, I have brought forth a human being, anthropos, by the help of the Lord. We don't need to go into that. I just say that to say that's part of how John's building a theme. Like we talked about in our last episode, there's a way in which Mary is kind of a reverse symbol of Eve because she's called the mother of the living, but she brought forth people who would die. Mm-hmm. Whereas Mary is going to bring forth the one who dies on the cross and brings life to all. But the point is this, by calling her woman, the Gospel of John is building a theme. That goes along with this idea of the word of hour, right? We're going to see a theme built to the Gospel of John where the mother, woman, and hour come together. So Jesus says, woman, what has this to do with you and me, not just me? And then he evokes this notion of my hour. My hour has yet to come. And of course, we know his hour will be the crucifixion.
He'll use those words will be used specifically right as he gives up his last breath.
Yes, hour, which we often track, his hour, right? But in those places where that word hour tracks towards his crucifixion, the Gospel of John, the language of not simply of the woman and the mother always show up. So this idea of what has this to do with you and me, my hour has not yet come, she shares in that. They have the hour together, so to speak.
To kind of sum up what we're saying is that this wedding at Cana story is put at the very beginning of, it's the first sign because it prefigures the great sign, the last sign, the hour at which all of these things that are shared here happen. The people receive salvation. They receive life in the giving of the sacrifice, the sacrificial lamb, right there. We have the glory, heaven and earth meet right on the Son of Man, right there in that hour of glorification, and we have this exchange between Jesus and Mary and a disciple or the disciples, right, that are at the center of that. So it's a prefiguring. It's a way. It's like in a movie when you foreshadow a scene that's to come, because that scene. That event of Christ's death on the cross, that is the center of it all. Yeah. Everything connects through that. Everything gets its meaning and significance through it. And that's why the gospel writer decides to... He places us at the very front. He places us at the very front.
The death and resurrection of Christ casts a shadow back across the whole story.
Yes.
And it's not simply third day and wedding and wine. It's also these words of mother and woman and hour. That's part of that shadow it casts back, which we're going to track. Okay? Should I move on to the next?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So there's the next passage that people often miss as actually being about Mary. It's John 16:21. It's a short parable Jesus tells. And I'm going to read a very literal translation because most translations actually fail to pick up on this. And when you hear me read it, we're going to talk about it. Listen for those words again. The woman... mother, the woman, our, and this idea of human being. Remember, we talked about Eve bringing forth the human being in the background in Genesis. So John 16:21. When the woman, this is Jesus speaking, I'm sorry. When the woman is in labor, she has grief because her hour has come. But when she gives birth to the child, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy that a human being has been born into the world. Now, I want to say a couple things about that. Your translation might look a little different. First, it's not going to say the woman, or just say when a woman, but the Greek is literally the woman. The other thing is this. Your translation might say something like, when a woman is in labor, she has pain, or sad, or something like that. And the reason for that is the Greek word used here, and I don't remember off the top of my head, it actually is grief. It's like grieving over death. It does not mean pain, but the translators say that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so they try to make it make sense by putting in something like pain or anguish. But it's literally when the woman is in labor, when she's bringing forth this fully formed human being, so to speak, well, that's kind of anticipating, she has grief. Right, as though mourning. But when the child is born, there is joy. And of course, it speaks of her hour.
Okay.
Right?
So this is important. Those words, again, we're highlighting those words, but I also want to do what we did with the first story in John chapter 2 here, is also give it its context to see how it's directly related to the cross. Because what we have here is Jesus tells this parable as a response to the disciples' question. Jesus says, you're going to have me for a little while longer, and then I'm going to go away. But then I will return and you'll have joy, right? And so the disciples, this is earlier on in 16, just before this, they're all confused and upset. What do you mean you're going away? Well, he's going away because he's going to die on the cross, right? And then he's going to return when he's resurrected. So when Jesus gives this parable, the parable of this woman that is giving birth, right, that is in grief, he's talking about the cross.
Yes.
So the whole context, Jesus this entire time is talking about the cross. And so in that sense, the parable is speaking about what's happening at the cross.
Yeah, and so significantly, there's this backdrop idea that, Mary is being played off of Eve, who's called the mother of the living because she brings forth a human being. But that human being both kills somebody else and dies. It's Cain. So it's kind of ironic. But Mary is bringing forth the true human being. And then significantly, Jesus is presented in the Gospel of John not just as God, but as the true human being. And as right before he gets crucified, he's got the crown of thorns and he's bloodied. And Pontius Pilate says this famous line when he presents Jesus all with the crown of thorns and all beaten up and about to die. He says, "Behold the human being." Right? So Christ is close to death. He's giving himself completely in obedience to his Father and for the sake of others. And at last, there's a true human being in the world, right? So it's this idea that Mary, not simply at the Christmas story, but her whole story along with Christ's is bringing into the world at long last the true human being who is Christ, the crucified one, right? And so you've got this idea.
So all of these things are anticipating this great event where heaven and earth meet in the Paschal Lamb, in the 3-day mystery, in the wedding, in that wedding, the marriage of God and humanity through the forgiveness given by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Both of these stories are foreshadowing; they're connected to that,
right.
And I think we're gonna.
And there's this hour language. Remember, in the wedding at Cana, Christ says, "What has this to do with you and me?" Then he says, "My hour."
Right.
And then in 16, he does this parable that's clearly about the crucifixion, this bringing forth of the human being through his own suffering and dying, and calls it her hour, right? So this you and me, my hour, your hour, and then the hour is going to come together at the crucifixion of Christ.
Yeah, so let's jump there real quick because I know we got a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, so
19, right?
John 19, and then I'm just going to read a short section where our words are going to show up again. So John 19, 26 through 27. Listen for the mother, woman, and hour, like the way Christ addressed her as woman, and then the mother, and of course grief and the hour they share. So Jesus is hanging on the cross at this point. And again, I'm doing a very literal translation of this. It's not what you'll see exactly in your Bible. Jesus then saw the mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby. This is as he's hanging on the cross. He said to the mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." From that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. So we've got it there again. Christ sees not, and it's interesting, he doesn't simply see his mother, he sees the mother who's been named through these stories. And then he says, he addresses her the same way as he did at the wedding of Cana.
Yes.
Right? And it's not, it's not a question of whether it's rude or it shows honor. The issue is the way it ties these things together, right?
That's right.
Woman, behold your son. And then, of course, from that hour, Christ's hour.
Well, and that's highlighted by the fact that right after that, you read from 27, and from that hour the disciple took her into his home, and the following verses, after this, when Jesus knew all was now finished. In other words, that this exchange happened, right? The hour, the mother, the woman, right? Then Jesus, it says, from that point, after this, he's seen that it's finished, right? Then he says, "I'm thirsty." He gives up the ghost, and basically, it's been accomplished. Like that. Right. My point is the finality happens. The hour occurs right there. Right there.
Right. That is the hour.
Right.
Right.
So in that sense, I think that shows how crucial those words are as John lays out the story.
And Mary, as the mother, is in her grief. To tie that to the parable, right? She's, in some sense, she's still laboring to bring forth the true human being, Jesus, right? Humanity is being made in him through his suffering and dying and then rising. She doesn't yet have the joy of the resurrection, but she has, so to speak, the grief of this labor, which is precisely why back in John 16, that parable doesn't say she has pain in labor, but she has grief, because they share this hour together, as any mother would share. When a mother experiences the death of her son, the suffering would not just be in one of them, right? It's a shared suffering, right?
So I think there's some really important things that we want to start to begin to pull out of all of this theologically and spiritually, right? There's the actual connection between, I think one of the big things we want to talk about is the actual relationship between Jesus and Mary.
Right.
And also the kind of character that is demonstrated in the posture of Mary as she's interacting with Jesus in that. So what do we want to talk about first?
Well, I mean, let's just characterize everything she's done, right? She's basically just simply asked for the celebratory wine of communion, of the wedding. She's told people to obey anything he says, and she's accompanied Christ to the cross. Those are her actions, right? Which seems like very, very little compared to some other characters. However, in many ways, that makes her, next to Christ, the most central character of all. In fact, she kind of embodies his own character, right? The one who existed from all eternity as God and reduces himself down to a human being and then to, a corpse, right? He empties himself, to use the language of the Apostle Paul, becomes as nothing, is supremely humble. She shares that precisely in her very quiet presence in the gospel, right? That doesn't mark her off as a minor character or unimportant. She precisely shares the life of God in the way that she, points people to Christ and accompanies them all the way to the cross and shares that hour with him. In that, and not being this larger-than-life character, in that precisely, she's kind of this exalted character, because she is like her son in that way.
So there's something, I think, fundamental here about Christian spirituality that's probably important to be discussed, and that is that Christ is the one who is glorified, whose name is above every other name, precisely because he became nothing. He thought of himself as nothing and was reduced to nothing for our sake, right? And that what we find in Christian spirituality is all those who take up the way of Christ, that become God bearers, they begin to be marked by this same pattern.
Right.
So, for example, we're familiar, we've shared this before, Mysteria regarding the Apostle Paul. I think you preached on this a couple of weeks ago, that we see with Paul this continual progression where he sees himself less and less and less and less. He, in his own mind, gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, precisely because Christ is being revealed more and more and more within him. He decreases and Christ increases, and that's the transformation, that's his salvation in Christ. He's becoming united to Christ. He is a God bearer. That means Christ's spirit is within him, and that's not just a generic thing. That has a very specific form. The specific form is he begins to look like Jesus, which means he becomes less and less. At the same time, right, the glory of God, the very face of God, begins to show more and more and more within him.
In becoming less and less the way we would characterize as less and less, he's becoming more and more godlike, indeed sharing more and more the life of God himself. And in the Gospel of John, John likes to put these really dramatic, important statements in the lips of certain characters. And John the Baptist himself has maybe one of the key statements in all the Gospel of John to understanding the human ideal, where John the Baptist says of Christ, concerning Christ, he says, I, John, must decrease so that he can increase.
Right.
And Paul fits that pattern you just described. But Mary, likewise, right? Her story and his are bound up utterly and totally together. Her story is his story. Right? She has decreased and Christ is everything, which is not a marker of her insignificance. In some sense, quite the opposite.
Yeah, so let's talk about this a bit more, because I think a lot of people are familiar with thinking about that in relationship to Jesus, but then we think it stops at Jesus, and we might say, well, I could try to be a little bit more humble in my life or whatever. But we don't recognize that what's actually happening here is Christ is the very center. He's the author and perfecter, but around him is a whole, to use the biblical language, a whole cloud of witnesses that themselves begin to take on this shape. They almost orbit around Jesus Christ in this way, and they take on the pattern. This pattern, if we follow this pattern, we see it in the lives of the saints and the fathers, for example. The very writers that we've been exploring throughout Mysterion, they all have that general kind of characteristic. Historically, if we want to figure out, for example, the life of Maximus Confessor, or the life of, know something more about the life of, Gregory the Theologian or Evagrius, it's kind of hard. And one of the reasons why is not just because they're ancient figures, it's because they don't talk about themselves. And when they do talk about themselves, they tend to only talk about their limitations. Now, these characters, these figures, these are historical people just like you and me, with many of them brilliant minds, extremely competent, extremely able, and yet they look at themselves as nothing. They don't write about themselves at all. Think about the contrast between that and my Facebook profile or my Instagram profile, where I'm constantly telling the world about myself.
You're on Instagram?
Yeah.
Oh, good. New jokes.
What I ate for lunch, and hey, this is my political opinion, and this is what car I just bought. We're constantly presenting ourselves to where, hey, world, this is who I am. It's
self-promotional. We're trying to expand the self, make it bigger, right?
But what we find is the very form of Christian spirituality is these people get more and more invisible, precisely because Christ is becoming more and more visible. And again, I want to contrast that with even some of the more popular spiritual teachers today. The pastors that are really popular today on television, the ones that everyone says, we got to follow these guys. I mean, most of them, they're in an endless practice of self-promotion. I mean, they got personal trainers to look about as sexy as they possibly can. They're always got the latest styles.
Clearly,
and the latest
we don't.
things. Right, exactly, right. But my point is that they're in an endless popularity contest. How different, how much in contrast is that in relationship to not just Christ,
right,
but Christ surrounded by the saints who have taken on this character.
I mean, to be fair to people in our world, that's the ethos of our culture, right?
Oh yeah,
and that gets
definitely.
back again to season 2. This idea of the ideal relationship of me to myself is an entrepreneurial one. Expand and grow the brand of Ethan, right? Right. But that's really problematic. It's not just that God frowns on that, but it cuts us off from the life of God, right? So we go back to why does Christ call us to this humility? It's not so we can make room for, go low so you can make room for him to be high, but God has a humble life.
Right.
It's precisely to share in God's life that we are called to this humility, right? It's paradoxically, those who are humbled will be exalted, precisely because God's life is a humble one.
Right.
Humility and exaltation are the same. And back to your point, like somebody like Maximus the Confessor, you were pointing this out as we were preparing. This is one of the greatest minds ever to live, not even just in the Christian tradition, right? We know next to nothing about him. He says next to nothing about himself, and as you pointed out when we were preparing, he mostly makes fun of himself. Some of the greatest spiritual writers we have from the early hundreds of years of the Christian church, they wrote under the name of somebody else, not simply to give their writings greater status to be associated with another person, but precisely to deflect attention away from themselves. There's some great name, you write in their name precisely so you don't gain attention and popularity. They're seeking not to become these expanded, exalted selves. They want to become less and less, and thereby have the life of Christ shine through them more, even to the extent that some of these people who wrote such profound texts on love and holiness, they refuse to put their own names on the text. So when you read ancient patristic literature, so often you see pseudo such and such, or pseudo, like we don't know who it really was. It's just they put the name under Macarius or whomever, and it's that same thing. It's not self-promotional at all. Not just because there's an ideal of humility,
but it's
actually this is the way to share in the life of God.
Yes.
To share the hour with Christ when he becomes nothing for others and is thereby exalted as the great one.
So to become a God bearer is to progressively become more and more invisible, precisely so that, through which that is one of the marks of Christ becoming visible, right? As Christ is being seen in that way. And I think when we see that, for example, someone like Mary, it begins to change our whole idea about what is the great deed. What is the great work that God wants you to accomplish? We tend to think if God's going to do something great through me, what that's going to involve is, I don't know, it's obviously going to show up on the radar of the world, right? Well, what did Mary do? What did she accomplish? She said yes, and she accompanied Jesus. Now, I guess what I'm trying to say is, maybe to me that is a question about, do we say, well, Mary's not very relevant because she just accompanied Jesus, or do we need to redefine what relevance is? What great work is God going to do through us? I mean, is the greatest work that God could do through us our accompanying him to the cross and
simply to share the hour,
with him, right? To be present to him that way.
And right? I think about the spiritual desolation that comes from this idea, these ways that pride sneaks in, right? This like you're gonna go do this great deed rather than what you're describing. Like I talk to so many people, I counsel so many people that they're living these sort of quiet, faithful lives, and they experience that as failure. That's not failure, right? this gets back to some of the stuff we talked about in season 2 of this idea of the way pride sneaks in. Like if you just follow Jesus with all your heart, you're going to go do this. And what's in there, what is sneaky in there, is the kind of exaltation of self, expand yourself, right? This entrepreneurial project of you through Jesus. But that gets it opposite. I mean, he's the crucified one. He's the humble one. A quiet life of loving those around you, and bearing responsibilities with humility and faith, and a great love practiced in all these small ways is to share the life of God. And there's nothing greater in all the world than that.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder too, was there another yes, in the sense that Mary not only said yes to conceiving Christ, but she watched her son die. The sacrifice that's entailed in witnessing that, and not running away. I mean, she's standing at the cross. There's a yes there. There's I'm willing to allow that, even though this is causing me deep suffering. That's a deep sacrificial act. It's a deep sacrificial act. It kind of reminds me of, I think especially mothers. I can speak to this somewhat as a father, but it's especially true of many mothers. Like the amount of sacrifice that is required when people give up so much of themselves to their children, and sometimes it feels like your life just stops for 10 years or 20 years, and you're ragged, right? And the deep sacrifice that's required to love another in that way, it is not romantic, it's not heroic, but that's the love that sustains the human being. That's what keeps the human race going.
That's the that's the love that brings the life of God into the world.
Yeah, and it's not pretty, and it's not romantic. I mean, most of the time it's not romantic. It involves like fatigue. It is about perseverance. It's about endurance. But why are these not great acts? Why are these not forms of the glory of the glory? They are the forms of glory of God. I think as a culture, we've got so far away in our understanding of what it means to have glory and honor. For us, it's to accomplish things. It's to make a name for oneself. It's to do something and make an impact, right? And those things are very tantalizing. But we find that the way of Christ, the way of bearing Christ within us, is actually leading us. It's a harder road, but it is the essential road, right? It is the way in which we come to share in and accompany Jesus, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to go with that. That's good stuff.
So, some of the old language, I guess what I'm trying to say is this, there's some of this old language and terminology that's given to Mary. Like she's called one is like Queen of Heaven. And I think one of the things is that makes Protestants go, oh, like that.
Well, to your point, if I could, so I want to get this in. So Shannon and I went to Greece last year on our honeymoon, right? And so we got to see churches from the first millennium of Christian history. In Thessaloniki, one church was from the 5th century, so the 400s. And the churches over there, those ancient churches, are set up like temples. We often talk about temples, and it's got the three, the outer court, inner court, Holy of Holies. Those churches are set up that way, right? In all of them, without fail, what's over top of the Holy of Holies, which represents, heaven, right? This is where God is, the revelation of Christ is. This is where the union this is where the wedding feast is. There is always, always, always a giant icon of Christ sitting on Mary's lap, and that made me think, when you're talking about what it concretely looks like to be a mother in this world, and the sacrifice and the fatigue, and it's ragged, and it's that loving for another, giving for another, in some ways becoming small to give your life to another. That is what was in the Holy of Holies every single time.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, and that picture, I guess my point in bringing that up, and the language of for example, Queen of Heaven. Again, it can be startling for folks that are not used to it, but think about this. The entire scene in the book of Revelation we have heaven is just populated with a multitude of creatures, all right, a multitude of beings. And what is every single being doing? In one form or another, they are turning away from themselves and towards the throne of God. Whether it's the four living creatures who are constantly saying, holy, 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 whether it's the elders and that are casting their crowns down, all of everything that's gathering in heaven is saying, I am nothing, you are everything. And at the center of it is the Lamb who was slain for the world, who became a slaughter for us. So my whole point is that is the dynamic of heaven, is I will decrease, you will increase, facing the God who decreased so that we would increase, right?
That's joy, yes,
right?
absolutely.
And again, if that's your picture of heaven, you recognize that's what we see. Then when we see Mary as this person who just gave her life to accompany him from birth to death.
That's heaven.
Who became nothing. She is, we could say, leads the procession of the saints. Because not because she's separate than the rest of us, not because she's totally unlike the rest of us, as we've seen from all of the saints that we talk about, the ones in Scripture, the ones in history, they're all doing this. They're all doing this. And yet we find Mary is the one who said, I will make space within me. I will die. My life will no longer... We don't know. Mary's life is no life apart from Jesus. She just accompanies Jesus. And in that way, we could say that she marks heaven. Her character, her posture in relationship to Jesus is the posture of every being in heaven.
Right.
And when we ourselves enter fully into that place, that will be our posture as well. May he increase, may I decrease. And so to talk about Mary, to understand Mary this way, is to understand us in solidarity with her, accompanying her as she accompanies Jesus Christ. So,
good stuff.
I'm starting to preach it, man. Like
Preach. That's good stuff. That's right. You know, what we see playing out in her life in relationship to Christ is exactly what we see in the life of all the living ones in heaven, right?
Every single
And so
one.
she has these titles precisely because she shows us what it is for that world to break into this world, right?
Yeah.
And that is a difficult and hard life, but it's also the life of joy, the life shared with God, the wedding feast with God.
One more thing about it. I know I'm getting preachy here, but I want to say one more thing. And that is this. I think to highlight and to talk about someone like Mary, we could do the similar thing we do with Paul and John and some of these other characters. Should remind us that we are not alone in pursuing Christ in this way. As we seek to be God bearers, as we seek to cooperate with God, we aren't by ourselves, and the difficulties that we face, the trials, the struggles that we face, we are not facing them alone. Others have gone through those same things, and they are, in some sense, we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. And I think that that's encouraging. At no point in my spiritual life, even if what I'm facing right now feels new and foreign and difficult and I feel alone, I am not alone. Not only because I'm bearing Christ within me, but because I'm surrounded by all of these others who have taken and are taking that same journey along with me. And I think that's encouraging and it's strengthening for us. So to talk about Mary isn't to deflect from Jesus Christ. It's not to make Christ less.
Well, it can't be, because she became nothing, so he'd be everything.
Right.
So when we pay attention to her, we're directing our gaze to him.
And she's one of the company, right?
She's one of the cloud.
She's one of the cloud. She's one of the company who surrounds that throne, as you described in the church of Thessaloniki. Yeah. So
All
anyway, good stuff. Hey, share your thoughts. Let us know. And I think we are going to take 1 week off before we launch next season. We really hope that you join us in this next season. I think we're going to try to go beyond talking, and we're going to start to get ready to do some practices together. We'd love to be able to do that with you.
Let us know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe, send money, whatever you want.
See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.